I'm thinking about the, I think, quite commonsensical idea that not every library is the same, not every collection is the same, but collections have the imprint of their collector on them and have an imprint of the kind of implicit or explicit ideologies that these collectors have when they set out to collect. And what I'm hopefully going to argue and maybe convince you today is that the Seetzen collection is particularly valuable as a window into a specific kind of book culture in the 19th century that that in a sense has been obscured by later collections that are more that were more done by trained Orientalists. I think there is something to be said about Seetzen as not an expert in Oriental studies who has carried out these collections and the kind of collection that he therefore has created. And as a starting point for my talk, I want to start with an insight that Birgit Schäbler expressed a quarter of a century ago in an article she wrote about Seetzen, namely through, in my mind, really kind of insightful comparison that she made to Alexander von Humboldt. I want to explore a little bit the parallels to Humboldt, but then also the differences between Seetzen and Humboldt. So the first thing that Schäber also mentioned is that Seetzen and Humboldt were contemporaries. They knew each other. They were in the same intellectual circles, and they saw their projects, their travels, their exploratory travels in very similar terms. Of course, Alexander von Humboldt is the much more famous person. I found an online article written in the United States, which is on Humboldt, and it starts with saying, "Why is everything in the United States called after Humboldt?" Or why are so many things in the world called after Humboldt? There are places and parks, and obviously the streams, the Humboldt stream, etc. And that really is a testament to his influence. So Humboldt carried out his most famous scientific travel between 1799 and 1804. Seetzen started a little bit later in 1802, and then, of course, he never returned, but he died in 1811. So there is an overlap there. What is so remarkable about Humboldt is that he after his return created these remarkable and really for the first time these groundbreaking, particularly visually, but scientific studies of all kinds of things, and the breadth of his scholarship is so remarkable. This is just one of the examples that I found particularly impressive. A map of the Earth's crust. He came from a mining background, but he was also interested in the flora and the fauna. You can see this, all of this described in really painstaking detail. And the material that he created, the maps that he drew, the images that he drew. Right? There's the famous images of animals. So he was great at drawing. Bonpland, who came with him, was also great in drawing. All of this is really kind of foundational for our knowledge of South America. He collected minerals, he described them in detail, brought them back. But what is really important to keep in mind is that Humboldt survived his travels. He came back. He lived another 50 years, almost, in which he, or more, in fact, more than 50 years. In which he published and these beautifully illustrated dozens of volumes of travel description and articles, etc., etc. While of course we do not have that from Seetzen. However, we do have actually nevertheless a significant amount from Seetzen. We do have his diaries. He wrote his diaries and then mailed them back to Germany. I think the last one we have is from 1809 that he sent back from Egypt. He was sending letters back and forth, letters that described his observations. Even I mean, there is literary journals where he published poems that he composed on Oriental themes, etc. So that is actually quite rich. And then, of course, we have the various artifacts and books that he collected. Obviously, I'm going to talk mainly about the books, but there's also, of course, artifacts, particularly pharaonic artifacts that he sent back. In terms of the description, as I said, we none of this is as worked out as Humboldt did it, but we can see here on the left-hand side there is a description. I mean, volume 3 of his diaries, like the last 120 pages, are these kind of zoological observations where he took an animal and then he measured it, etc., etc., kind of quite in detail. On the right-hand side, we have sketches that he made. We know he made sketches from, he visited the Mecca, and he made a sketch of the inside of the Kaaba, etc. So there's a lot of that same spirit of exactly measuring things. And he was interested in astronomy. He observed the stars on the Sinai Peninsula. And sent these measures back. He did measures in the Arabian Peninsula, etc. So there is the very same kind of scientific and the breadth of scientific interests that he brought with him. So he was not, in fact, trained in Oriental languages or texts. He learned Arabic in Aleppo primarily. He spent quite a long time. I mean, he tried to learn Arabic in Istanbul, maybe not necessarily the best place to learn Arabic, but then he spent a longer time in Aleppo to learn Arabic, and actually became quite good at it. Although there's some, in the record we find also some shortcoming of his Arabic, but nevertheless there is the same kind of breadth of looking at the world as a kind of lab, in which you don't focus on anything specific, but you observe everything. Here, these are some of the objects he brought home with him, not brought home with him, but he sent home, including mummies, etc. He was also, I mean, very interested in engineering projects. He had this dream of building. I mean, he was from Ostfriesland, I think. He had this dream of connecting parts of Germany with the Netherlands, and then he also became kind of obsessed with kind of the canals that had been built between the Nile and the Red Sea. So there's a lot of these ideas kind of develop, and of course eventually they end up with people building a canal between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea later in the 19th century. But he connects these things. This is from a letter to the Austrian Orientalist Josef von Hammer-Purgstall. But he was really, for him these things were not different. Him reading al-Mas'udi, his account of a kind of a Muslim canal, a Muslim-built canal, and the kind of earlier canal that had been built by the in pharaonic Egypt. All of this comes together, and all of this shows the kind of breadth of interest that he had. Now, when one looks at these scientific interests that parallel von Humboldt, there's a mirroring effect in which, on the one hand, he has an interest in observing these things, but then also he has an interest in collecting books on these things. So you see on the right upper hand corner, this is the table of content of his diaries that show the various interests. Like he's talking about his investigation into the canals, his investigation into eye diseases, the pyramids, the fish, etc., etc. And then on the left-hand side, there's part of the table of content of the manuscript collections that he made. So again, he collected books on eye diseases, on natural history, on zoology, hunting, botany, mineralogy, etc., etc. So in that sense, von Seetzen is actually quite different from Humboldt, because Humboldt treated South America like a kind of a mute object to be studied, which in a sense was related to the subject matter. The Mayan hieroglyphs were not deciphered until the 1980s. The Incas didn't even have a written language. They had knots on strings, etc. But therefore, von Humboldt could study this as really as a scientist, simply just observes things, right? I mean, he was also interested in people. He has some sort of ethnographic observations. He also talks about slavery, etc., something that von Seetzen was also interested in. But Seetzen really was faced with a civilization that had an extensive written tradition. And so he extended his interest, his wide interest, the kind of vacuum cleaner approach to the data that he encountered, to the written tradition itself, and that was his approach to collecting books. So there is a short section in his diaries on his time in Cairo, where he kind of explicitly talks about the sources of his books. So this is relatively early on, where he figures out, Khan al-Khalili, until today, this is the place where you go to buy stuff. Today, it's kind of touristy. But he already finds out that there's 11 book dealers that he can use. That there are more than in Aleppo. There is the French have taken a lot of manuscripts, so the book market has become more expensive. But he's also aware of other sources, right? So he says there is a dozen book binders, right? So these are different kind of trades. Of course, we're talking about a manuscript culture. These are the booksellers are also people who reproduce books. They're copying books, but then the book binders, they are the ones who create the bindings for books. So why would book binders be sources for him? That's something one can only speculate on. But one of the materials that book binders used for creating bindings was discarded pages of books, right? So that they used to make the covers of the book. They glued together several pages of books that had fallen apart, or that were kind of scrap paper. So in that sense, and this is something I'll come to later when we look at a little bit of the collection of his books, there are elements in there. There are unbound copies, individual pages that might originate with such book binders. There are, I mean, throughout his diaries, you come across, there are other things. He bought books from individuals, from scholars. He met Abdurrahman al-Jabarti, the Egyptian Somali historian. He bought a book from him personally. So he kind of, this is just his first view of the book market in Cairo. This is an interesting, the question of astronomy is an interesting case study of Seetzen. On the one hand, being interested in astronomy and the state of astronomy that he found in Egypt, right? This is something one has to kind of keep in mind about the early 19th century, is that there was still a significant amount of scientific interest that believed that old books, particularly in the Orient, could yield knowledge that had been forgotten in Europe, or that was unknown in Europe. So he visits this Sheikh Osman al-Miqati, so who is somebody working in astronomy, figures out things like astronomic tables, and is into that, makes Taschen Sonnenzeiger. I don't know what the term for that in English is. But at the same time, that is also somebody who tells him about books, classical books of astronomy, and the kind of way you can buy stuff and for how much, etc., etc. So there's both of these things. Like he is somebody who's interested in astronomy, who has his own astronomic tools that he brings with him from Europe, that he makes observations. He gets in contact with local astronomers, and he buys books on astronomy. So he covers the entire range of direct observation, making connections to locals, and looking at the intellectual tradition in that field. And that's something that you can find throughout. A second case study to me that's interesting is his visit at the Amr ibn al-As mosque in Old Cairo, in Fustat, which he made in 1809. So he had already been there for a while. He had already been there for a year and a half or 2 years. First point to note is that he doesn't know what the name of this mosque is. He thinks it's Omar, after Omar ibn al-Khattab. Of course, it's Amr. You know, it looks similar when you write it in Arabic, but it's a totally different person. So that's a little bit embarrassing that he didn't know what this thing actually was. So this is the old central mosque of old Cairo. One of the old. It's not the oldest. One of the oldest mosques in Egypt. And so what he gives you in this account from his diary is he gives you a little bit of a description. He gives you a little bit of a kind of anthropological view into it. That this is an area where they make pots and pans. They are not as good as the ones from Upper Egypt. That there's a lot of there are a lot of that old Cairo has kind of fallen into disarray, and there are a lot of ruins. And then he enters the Amr Mosque. He says that there's several women who are kind of expecting some sort of bakshish from the people who visit, who show him the kind of lay of the mosque. He counts the number of pillars in there and gives a little bit of a description of it. And then he says the most important thing for scholars of language and the ancient world, Sprachforscher und Altertumskenner, is a little room in the Amr Mosque, has no windows, where a little boy brought him to. And in it, he found a heap of parchment pages. Some of them, or most of them, still bound, not into a single volume, but kind of connected. And he says possibly the oldest and most Quran that exists in the Islamic world. And in fact, he's correct with that. I mean, that's quite interesting that he managed to identify this, because these days, through radiocarbon dating, we know that this copy, of which some of it remains in Egypt, some of it went to France, and a few pages of them have made their way to Gotha, actually are from the 7th century. Probably were written by people who had met Muhammad. So this is really one of the oldest extant copies of the Quran that he saw there. So he describes them a little bit. A little bit of a kind of puzzling, partly puzzling, partly revealing section here is where he says, "Oh well, it's a shame that these things are languishing here," and he tries to buy some of them from these female caretakers in that area. But they refuse, and they say it's a waqf, i.e. it's an endowment. It belongs to the mosque. You can't just remove it. And his reaction to this is that this is Muslim bigotry, that they don't allow him to buy this from him. It's really strange. I mean, it's a very strange section, kind of totally unself-conscious about what he's doing. So he. At this specific point, he's not successful, but by the fact that we do have these folios that are in Gotha now, he must have been successful at some point with his efforts. So there are a number of folios that are now in Gotha from that codex of the Amr Mosque. So again, there's a wide variety of observations that he did. He didn't just go to the Amr Mosque to buy these folios. He went there as a visit, part of an expedition from the actual Cairo to Fustat, to Old Cairo, that is a little bit outside. He describes it and finds as one of the high points these old leaves of the Quran, and eventually buys some. Another really fascinating example is his engagement with the idea that the Fatimid Caliph Al-Hakim bi Amrillah built an observatory in the Muqattam Mountains, which are outside of Cairo, on the eastern side of Cairo. And so Al-Hakim bi Amrillah, 11th century Fatimid Caliph, is said to have built this observatory. So in his diaries, he has a description of how he's riding there. He describes the place. He describes the Muqattam Mountains, and then he says something about Al-Hakim bi Amrillah, and it's interesting that he uses historical sources for this. He uses Al-Maqrizi, 15th century Egyptian historian who wrote a lot about the Fatimids, who's our best source for it. So he knew that work. In fact, he bought a volume of Al-Maqrizi. In fact, he found a volume of Al-Maqrizi's autograph. So this is in the hand of Al-Maqrizi. He managed to get one volume. So we have several of Al-Maqrizi's works in his own hand, scattered mostly in the Western world. We have some in Leiden, in Leuven, I think at the University of Michigan. There are autographs. So he has access to this really accurate historian from the 15th century. And the second source is the Sira of Al-Hakim bi Amrillah, which is I mean, how do you call this? It's an epic. It's a popular epic or a novel. Sometimes people call it Heldenroman. In the catalog, it's called Heldenroman, like a hero's novel. It's not really a novel, but it's a popular story that was orally performed in places like coffee houses, etc., for entertainment. So he uses these two very different sources. This kind of very high culture historian who was very close to the time, and he used original documents to write the history of the Fatimids. And then you have this, basically the equivalent of a Hollywood movie. And in it, he tries to reconstruct the history of Al-Hakim bi Amrillah. So he tells about this kind of a dramatized story of Al-Hakim's assassination. And then he goes out and he finds the ruins, or what he thinks to be the ruins of this observatory. So again, what we see in this here is we have him taking really a global view of an issue. He is looking for something. He does kind of quasi-archaeological examinations. There is his immediate kind of travel narrative of how he got there, but then there's also textual work involved. Textual work where he takes very different sources, very a historian and a kind of a popular fictional work, and this is kind of part of a period. You read the letters to Hammer Purgstall when he plans to go to the Arabian Peninsula, and he has no idea about the geography there. And then Hammer Purgstall suggests, well, maybe you read the Sirat Antar, which is also a fictional book. And he says, oh, maybe you use that as your guide for the geography. And it's like, I mean, they really didn't have much to go on, but that was the time. So these are images of the two sources that he's discussing. On the left-hand side, there is this autograph of Al-Maqrizi. Says here on the right-hand side of it, هذا الكتاب بخط مؤلفه. This book is in the writing of its author. And on the right-hand side, there is this very I mean, you can even see from the handwriting, rather crude, popular, recently copied entertainment literature, right? And this is that kind of breadth of literature that really, I think, to me is what sets the Seetzen collection apart. That there is that there are books that would have been excluded by others, that would not have been collected by others, that he collects and that he preserves for us. And this, what you can see in the catalog, which is a lovely catalog written in the late 19th century. This is written by an expert, by an Orientalist expert in manuscripts, but he doesn't quite get and understand why Seetzen collected all these things, and you can see there's some sort of little bit of a suppressed rage in there, where he says. There's a disadvantage of Seetzen's Massenkauf, this kind of indistinguishing kind of just acquiring anything he can get his hands on. He says much of it is ballast, so much of it is kind of useless stuff. Right? Stuffing is kind of useless, that has little or no value. And there's a lot of incomplete manuscripts. There is individual pages or just a few pages in this collection, and you can see this. Wait a little bit, like here, this entry in the catalog where he says, "I'm not even going to catalog this hand." It's like this poor cataloger is just like, I'm not even going to deal with this. It's just individual pages, and I don't know what it's about, and it's just, I'm just going to list them here, and unfortunately, we can't just throw it away. But if we had my way, we would just throw it away. Right? So this is 2-3 generations later. These are educated Orientalists who are interested in a specific kind of the Arabic Islamic written tradition, and for whom this stuff is just worthless. But as you might be able to guess, that particularly today, with people having different interests, actually that makes this collection really interesting. And one of the things that are in this collection that are really valuable are these ephemera, these written texts that were originally, as the definition here says, expected to have only short-term usefulness or popularity. I don't know, today, emails, text messages, whatever. This kind of stuff that, I don't know about your text messages, but mine definitely don't have any literary value, and really shouldn't be preserved. But for historians in the future, it might present them a window into our time that the properly published, or let's say, if you compare my text messages to my published books, it would give you a different view into the time in which we live, right? And just to give you some examples of these kind of strange texts that were not meant to be, that were not written in order to be displayed in a library, is, for example, the notebook of Kamal ad-Din the Weaver, which is in the collection, which will come out soon, edited by Christina Richardson and Boris Liebrenz. Just the next manuscript in that catalog is a notebook of a Syrian Christian. So these are private documents that people wrote about their daily lives, have no literary value, that probably have a lot of grammatical mistakes, whatever in them. So kind of classical Orientalists would have just said, okay, well, what is this? We don't need that. But they are in this collection, and they are really unique. That it is the kind of literature that we actually have very little or almost nothing of from these early time periods. Another issue that Boris Liebrenz has been studying, hasn't been, I don't think he has published on yet, but that he's studying at the moment, is these merchant letters that Seetzen collected. And these are letters that are really unique. We don't have any other examples of them as far as I know. And it is possible, you know, I've mentioned earlier his interest in bookbinders and things, that that he just bought up scrap paper. He bought up paper that was meant to be used for other stuff, not meant to be preserved, and that he thereby preserved for posterity, because they would have otherwise become part of bindings, or would have been used differently as scrap paper. Certainly wouldn't have made it into either a Middle Eastern library collection or into an Orientalist library collection. To just give you another couple of examples of kind of unusual pieces, so there are these cardboard exercise models for writing. You know, maybe people would have bought them otherwise because they look nice. You know, one could maybe frame them and put them somewhere. But these are texts for use, right? They are texts that are not literary texts. They are windows into a practice, into the practice of learning how to write. Right? So these are there is, I think, 8 of those in the collection that he bought, and that can teach us about you know, kind of the education of calligraphers and of people who learned how to read and write. There is an unusually extensive collection of popular literature. Mentioned already these Siyar, these Heldenromane, these popular epics. There's a lot of 1001 Nights stories in it. So there are here some examples. The very on the left hand side, this is the story of Al-Hakim bi Amrillah. The one in the middle is the story of Baybars. So this is an Egyptian sultan who lived you know, 200 years after Al-Hakim bi Amrillah in the 13th century. And on the right hand side, there is this is from 1001 Nights. So these are texts that are, I mean, neither of these have proper authors, because they were orally composed. They were orally composed and orally performed. In fact, I mean, some of like the Sirat Bani Hilal, these are things that are actually still performed today in kind of classical Arab coffee houses. And so these are vestiges and evidence of a living popular culture that existed in the 19th century. Many of these manuscripts are actually of recent provenance, were recently written. You know, a lot of this stuff was changed, and already Seetzen actually mentioned this in his letter to Hamad Purgstall, saying that these 1001 Nights stories, they don't actually go back to, you know, Harun Rashid and Baghdad and whatever what we think of. There are some of them that might, but people have, even in his own time, have continued to compose these kind of stories and add to this stuff. So there is a window into a living popular culture that is going on. There is one manuscript I've looked at that I haven't really seen anywhere mentioned in secondary literature, and that I found quite interesting. I've spent quite a bit reading in, which Seetzen calls songs about the French conquest of Egypt and Syria. In fact, Lieder über den Einfall der Franzosen in Ägypten und Syrien, which is a short book, I think a dozen pages, I think it's 20 pages about, of a kind of Arabic oral strophic poetry that's called Zajal. That was on the very issue of the day, the French occupation of Egypt between 1798 and 1801. It was composed in 1801, so just after the French had left, and it's kind of a unique text. As I said, I haven't seen anyone in secondary scholarship mention it. The catalog doesn't have an author for it, but I know who the author is. This man called Yusuf Safti, who is from Upper Egypt, graduate of Al-Azhar, and he has written kind of scholastic works on grammar, on law. He was also giving sermons. But this text is interesting because it is not what one would say proper Arabic in the sense of classical Arabic. It is very, I mean, if you look at the middle page, the upper line, Allah Yansur as-Sultan, even the spelling is awkward. It's Sultan is written with a Sad, and the very grammatical structures are colloquial. So this is a colloquial text that is these Zajal poems in this time, when people write about them, they like a little bit later, I mean, they've been studied in the later 19th century, and they're always used for popular mobilization. And this text itself seems to be of this kind, which it commemorates the French military expedition to Egypt and their push into Syria. But really, the hero of this story is Ahmed Jazar Pasha, who is the ruler of parts of the Levant, parts of Palestine, who emerges from this story as the hero who manages to fend off the French in their push into Syria. So it's a type of text that is really, I mean, it's a level of Arabic of which we have very few evidence otherwise. You know, we do have this oral colloquial writing poetry. We have that later 19th century, early 20th century. People make a big deal of it in that time. But this is a very rare document. And again, you know, I've read it. I've read most of it. Sometimes even I don't understand it. I read it with a friend who says, you know, maybe you have to be from Upper Egypt to understand some of those constructions. But it really opens a window into a type of literature that is not high literature at all. That is very popular. You could imagine people chanting this on the streets. Was this written and and used by celebrations for the French leaving? So this is an interesting and to me fascinating kind of document. If any one of you is interested, you know, you're free to adopt this or to give it to your PhD students to work on. But I just found it and I thought it was really interesting. Just the number again, it's MS Orient A2347. So to kind of wrap up with my talk, what I hope to have shown is that Seetzen's method of book collection was really was much broader than just later Orientalists' collection methods, and there are clear parallels to his kind of natural scientific method of observation and recording, and his interests for book collection, and that part of the I mean, on the one hand, that's exciting, and it provides us with exciting sources, but it also explains why Orientalists in the intervening period sometimes didn't quite know what to do with some of the material that he sent back, and particularly the kind of ephemera and more popular literary pieces have, I think, languished in Gotha, and I think that it is exactly those pieces that really hold the most. I mean, those pieces and these individual pages that have been difficult to classify. These kind of scrap, these things that he kind of rescued from the scrap paper that are the kind of treasures that are not yet that haven't been recognized yet, or are only just now being recognized as treasures by people like Christina Richardson and particularly Boris Liebrenz, who has of course worked so much on this collection. So on that sense, that collection, I hope to have shown, represents a specific kind of collecting, a specific kind of view of what it means to study the Orient, not just the kind of textual classical tradition of the Orientalist kind of approach, but a much more natural scientific one. And on the other hand, that that even the catalog and even the digitization practices, so these things that the catalog doesn't deal with are also not the ones that have been digitized so far. So these are things you actually have to go to Gotha and look at these things. But I actually hope to go there in person in the near future, and I encourage all of you to do this. Thank you very much.